In December 2024, during Africa Industrialization Week at the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, experts from the United Nations and the African Union made a bold statement. Africa needs to step up its investment in infrastructure. They're talking about building better roads, airports, energy systems, and even improving schools. Why? Because they believe these things are the key to speeding up industrialization and transforming economies across the continent. The idea is straightforward. If transportation, electricity, and communication are better, businesses will want to set up shop, people will get jobs, and the economy will thrive. But not everyone agrees that infrastructure alone can deliver these results. Some critics say this focus on big projects doesn't always create the kind of long-term changes people want to see. For the past 2 decades, especially during the 2010s, Africa has poured massive amounts of money into infrastructure projects, believing that better roads, railways, dams, and ports would unlock the door to industrialization and prosperity. The results? The continent now has better infrastructure than it did 20 years ago. But what it also has is a massive debt crisis. Many African countries borrowed heavily to fund these projects, and now they're struggling to pay back those loans. Instead of becoming a springboard for growth, this debt has turned into a heavy burden. What's worse, industrialization, the very goal of these infrastructure investments, has remained stagnant. Factories haven't sprung up at the pace leaders hoped, and Africa's economies haven't shifted towards producing high-value goods. Poverty and unemployment remain stubbornly high, with many young people unable to find decent jobs. At the same time, an increasing share of national revenues is being redirected to repay loans instead of being spent on things that directly benefit citizens like education, healthcare, and social programs. Essentially, many African citizens are paying the price for decisions made years ago to pursue large-scale projects that, according to the critics, haven't delivered the transformative change they were promised. And here's another issue that makes things even more complicated: corruption. Large infrastructure projects often come with large budgets, with questionable oversight mechanisms, and that can be an open door for misuse of funds. Some leaders and officials have been accused of inflating costs or directing money into their own pockets instead of the projects. Mismanagement, lack of transparency, and shady deals can eat up resources that were meant to improve lives, leaving unfinished or poorly executed projects that don't deliver what was promised. Despite all these challenges, the debt crisis, stagnant industrialization, persistent poverty, and even corruption, the United Nations and the African Union still believe in the infrastructure-led growth model. In fact, they want to double down on it. During Africa Industrialization Week in December 2024, their message was clear. Africa needs more investment in infrastructure to accelerate industrialization and transform economies. So they must have compelling reasons to believe this, right? After all, organizations like the UN and AU wouldn't keep pushing this model unless they truly thought it could work. So what's the truth? Is this infrastructure-led growth model, which Africa has followed for decades, really the key to sustainable and equitable prosperity for its people? Or is it doomed to fail, leaving the continent saddled with debt and unrealized dreams? And if this model isn't the answer, what path should Africa really be on? To understand this, we need to take a step back and look at where this idea of infrastructure-led growth came from. What made leaders and experts believe that building more was a solution? And how has this strategy played out in Africa over the last 2 decades? Only by tracing the history and examining the results can we begin to uncover the truth and figure out what should be next for Africa's future. Just before we go on, isn't it amazing to see the true picture of Kenya and Africa as a whole through this exploration? The insights are not only eye-opening, but incredibly empowering. And here's the best part. If you'd like to dive deeper into the data, view the transcript, and explore the charts and research sources behind this video, it's all just a click away. Click the link in the description to visit our Substack page, where you'll find the full transcript for this video. But it doesn't just stop there. By becoming a subscriber, you officially join our vibrant community of changemakers. You'll gain access to exclusive content, from transcripts of all our videos to inspirational, empowering, and educational newsletters like the ones you see here. And that's not all. We also have thought-provoking podcasts with world-class experts in business and innovation. These conversations are tailored to spark ideas and solutions for Africa's challenges. And most importantly, you'll stay in the loop with updates on every new video, project, and initiative we launch. So join us in this journey of learning, growth, and empowerment. Click the link, subscribe, and let's build a better future together. Now let's get back to the video. The story begins with a man named John Perkins and his blockbuster book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, which revealed the shocking truth behind the infrastructure-led development model and who it really benefits. John Perkins is not a name you hear every day, but his story might just make you question everything you knew about how the world works. In 2004, he published a book with a title that practically dared you to pick it up, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. It sounded like a spy thriller, but what Perkins claimed inside wasn't fiction. It was a first-hand account of how wealthy nations and global institutions like the World Bank used infrastructure development as a tool not to help countries grow, but to trap them in cycles of debt and dependence. Perkins described himself as a former economic hitman, whose official role was a consultant at a Boston-based consulting firm called Maine in the 1970s and 80s. Economic hitmen, or EHMs, are highly paid professionals who work behind the scenes to manipulate developing countries. Their goal? To funnel massive amounts of money from global organizations like the World Bank and USAID straight into the pockets of big corporations and a handful of wealthy elites who control natural resources. They do this by persuading nations to take on huge loans for infrastructure projects, promising it will lead to growth and prosperity. But in reality, these loans often leave countries drowning in debt and at the mercy of those who lent them the money. According to Perkins, his role as an EHM was not about helping countries grow or improve their economies. Instead, it was about securing US economic and political interests by pushing developing nations into massive debt. This was done under the guise of foreign aid or partnerships funded by institutions like the World Bank and USAID. The goal was clear: tie these countries to debt they couldn't repay and use that financial leverage to control their resources, policies, and governments. Perkins described how the process worked. Leaders of developing nations were encouraged to join a global network of power serving US commercial and political interests. Sometimes, that encouragement came as lucrative payoffs. Other times, it was blackmail, and in some cases, even threats to their lives. The target was never just the leaders, though. They were merely the entry point. The real aim, according to Perkins, was to enslave entire countries under mountains of debt while claiming to uplift their economies. In his book, Perkins reveals how he and his team would create sophisticated economic projections to convince governments to take on loans for massive infrastructure projects, dams, highways, airports, and industrial parks. These models were designed to look like they would guarantee economic growth, but Perkins admits their true purpose was manipulation, and as he put it, the numbers were impressive but misleading. They justified loans that would funnel billions into the hands of corporations while leaving the countries burdened with debt they couldn't manage. Perkins shares a striking example from his time in Jakarta, where he had to develop economic forecasts that would support the construction of a costly, expansive electric grid. Since electricity is seen as an essential for development, he was tasked with selling a dream of spectacular economic growth if the government invested in this project built by a Western contractor and funded by debt. His instructions from the top of Maine, the consulting company he worked for, were clear. Inflate projections to predict at least 17% growth, even though historical data suggested that 6 to 9% was more realistic. If the government agreed to the project, the contractors would secure substantial profits, boosting their stock prices and enriching their shareholders and executives. The convincing process could involve bribery, threats, or even blackmail, but the outcome was the same. Corporations thrived on the corruptibility of many leaders in developing countries, leaders who are often willing to trade the future prosperity of their people for personal gain. Economic hitmen would further push governments to purchase more products and services from Western companies, such as computer systems, medicines, tractors, and aircraft, all under the guise of development. While the GDP of the indebted nation might rise due to these projects, the benefits often stay within the circles of politically connected elites who own banks, hotels, and industries that directly benefit from the new infrastructure. What made this system so effective, Perkins explains, is that it was backed by the world's most powerful institutions. The World Bank, the IMF, and other international organizations gave the process credibility. Their stated mission of reducing poverty and fostering global development made the loans seem altruistic, but in reality, these institutions reinforced economic dependence and inequality, propping up a global system that benefited the wealthy at the expense of the poor. It's a system that sounds almost too calculated to be real, an empire built not with armies, but with contracts, spreadsheets, and empty promises. Perkins' revelations are a dark reminder of how noble-sounding ideals can be weaponized to serve the interest of a select few. For Africa, where infrastructure-led development has been the dominant strategy for decades, Perkins' story raises uncomfortable questions. If so much of this development model was based on flawed or self-serving economic ideology, how much of Africa's infrastructure boom has really been about progress, and how much of it has been about control? To understand what's happening in Africa today, Perkins' story is a crucial piece of the puzzle. His experiences give us a lens to view the decisions of global powers and their impact on developing nations. Let's dive deeper and see how the patterns Perkins exposed decades ago still echo in Africa's modern-day quest for growth and prosperity. Let's take Kenya as an example. According to a paper by economic advisor to the President of Kenya, David Lee, Kenya offers a striking example of how the promise of infrastructure-led growth can go sideways. Back in 2013, a newly elected government unveiled an ambitious plan to transform the country's energy sector. Their goal? To add 5,000 megawatts of power generating capacity within just 4 years, nearly quadrupling Kenya's existing capacity from 1,800 megawatts to a staggering 6,800 megawatts. The thinking was clear. With enough power, Kenya could turbocharge industrialization, attract investment, and power its way to prosperity. On paper, the plan looked bold and exciting. Projections suggested Kenya's energy demand would grow rapidly, hitting that 6,800 megawatt target somewhere between 2024 and 2029, depending on how fast the economy expanded. But just 2 years later, cracks began to show. By 2015, Kenya's generation capacity had increased to 2,800 megawatts, but actual demand was only 1,900 megawatts. Not only was this demand far below expectations, it was even 17% lower than the government's own baseline forecast. The problem wasn't just the overestimation of demand. As the government continued pushing for massive energy infrastructure projects, updated forecasts painted a far less optimistic picture. According to Mr. Ndii, the revised projections showed that Kenya wouldn't need the planned 6,800 megawatts until 2037, if at all. Even in the most optimistic high-demand scenario, that requirement wouldn't come into play until 2032, given the current growth rate of energy needs. And yet, the costs of this overreach were very real. electricity bills soared, leaving businesses and households struggling with higher costs. The reliability of power systems declined, and the country's main power distributor spiraled into financial distress. Kenya's story highlights the risks of getting infrastructure planning wrong. Leaders and experts promised that massive energy investments would unleash growth and industrialization, but instead, the country ended up with a mismatch. More power than it could use, higher costs for citizens and businesses, and a struggling energy sector. It's a textbook case of how ambitious infrastructure plans, when not carefully aligned with realistic needs, can backfire, leaving a legacy of debt and underperformance. Energy is a fascinating topic that deserves its own deep dive because cheap, abundant, and reliable energy is the foundation of any prosperous society. But energy is just the fuel. What truly drives progress is the engine. And here's the thing, it doesn't matter how much fuel you have if your engine can't take advantage of it. Without the right engine, even the best resources go to waste. In this video, we're breaking down the engine that's supposed to lead Africa to sustainable and equitable prosperity, the infrastructure-led growth model. Once we understand how this engine is built and whether it's running as it should, we can turn our focus to the fuel. So where did this model first take hold in Kenya, and how did it come to dominate the country's developing strategy? The blueprint for Kenya's infrastructure-led growth strategy can be traced back to a 2010 report from the World Bank titled Kenya's Infrastructure, A Continental Perspective. This report, part of the Africa Infrastructure Country Diagnostic Project, emphasized the transformative potential of infrastructure investments. It claimed that improved infrastructure could boost Kenya's annual per capita GDP growth by as much as 3.3 percentage points if the country could match the infrastructure levels of Africa's middle-income nations. Energy infrastructure, in particular, was identified as the most pressing need, with reliable power supply deemed essential for boosting productivity and industrialization, and we've already seen how that went. The report also highlighted other areas requiring investment, such as roads, water and sanitation, ICT, and urban infrastructure. But looking back, we have to ask, how many of these projects have delivered on their promises, and how many have turned out to be costly ventures that left Kenya worse off? Kenya borrowed heavily to fund its infrastructure boom, often relying on Eurobonds and other high-interest loans from Western financial institutions. These loans, while financing major projects, came with steep costs, both in financial terms and in the form of harsh conditionalities imposed by lenders like the IMF when repayment faltered. If you haven't seen our video, How Responsible is the IMF for Africa's Debt Crisis, linked in the description, it dives deeper into these issues. And here's another tough question. How much of this borrowed money actually went into building roads, power plants, or water systems? How much was siphoned off by those who stood to gain the most from this infrastructure-driven model? The answer reveals a troubling pattern of who really benefits. The first beneficiaries are government contractors, both local and international, who secure lucrative contracts for these projects. Many of these contractors profit handsomely, sometimes through inflated bids or by winning tenders due to political connections. Then there are the wealthy Western financial institutions that funded much of Kenya's infrastructure expansion. These banks and investors earn substantial returns on their loans, regardless of whether the projects succeed in driving economic growth. But the list doesn't stop there. Politicians and high-ranking officials also benefit, often through kickbacks from contracts, embezzlement, or other corrupt practices tied to large infrastructure budgets. In some cases, they even hold indirect stakes in companies awarded major projects. Global corporations supplying materials and technology for construction also profit, as do consulting firms that collect hefty fees for feasibility studies and financial modeling, regardless of the long-term viability of the projects. Finally, elite investors and lobbyists, often with ties to the political class, cash in through land speculation and increased property values near new infrastructure projects. These benefits rarely trickle down to the average Kenyan. While this select group of beneficiaries enjoys massive financial gains, the average Kenyan has been left to bear the burden. As we saw in our video on our African leaders failing to create opportunities at home, also linked in the description below, these growth measures have not led to widespread growth. The country now faces a rising debt crisis, harsh austerity conditions imposed by the IMF, persistent poverty and unemployment, and stagnant GDP per capita growth. The infrastructure-led growth strategy, touted as a solution to Kenya's development challenges, seems to have largely benefited those at the top: contractors, politicians, financial institutions, and corporations, while leaving the majority of Kenyans struggling with higher costs and fewer opportunities. This isn't just a Kenyan story. It's happening across sub-Saharan Africa. Over the past decade, the region's public debt has skyrocketed. Debt distress is now back on the horizon, casting a shadow on the continent's future. What makes this even more striking is the timing. When the call for massive infrastructure investment first gained momentum, Africa was riding high on a wave of economic expansion. Between 1994 and 2014, the continent experienced a period often referred to as Africa Rising, with per capita incomes increasing by nearly 40% after years of decline. But since 2014, that momentum has slowed dramatically. Economic growth is now barely keeping up with population growth, leaving little room for meaningful improvements in living standards. So while billions were poured into infrastructure to power an economic revolution, the reality is that much of Africa has ended up with rising debt, stagnating economies, and a lingering question: if infrastructure-led growth hasn't delivered the prosperity it promised, what went wrong? But here's where things get even more baffling. Over the last 3 decades, while many African countries have been pouring billions into shiny new infrastructure projects, several Asian nations like Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Vietnam have leapfrogged ahead in terms of economic prosperity, and they've done it with infrastructure that, on paper, is worse than what some African countries have been building. To understand why, we need to take a closer look at what these Asian countries did differently and what lessons Africa can learn from their approach. First of all, for context, gross national income, or GNI, is a measure of a country's total economic output. It includes the value of all goods and services produced within a country, like its GDP, plus any income earned from abroad, such as profits, investments, and remittances. In simple terms, GNI gives us a broader picture of how much money is flowing into a country's economy and how wealthy it really is. Now, when comparing economic progress between South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa over the last 30 years, GNI is an incredibly useful measure because it captures not just the size of their economies, but the overall income their people and businesses are earning. Looking at the graph, something stands out right away. In 1990, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa had almost identical GNIs, both hovering around the $2,500 mark. It was a relatively even playing field, which makes what happened next even more eye-opening. Fast forward to 2018, and South Asia's GNI has skyrocketed to over $7,000, while Sub-Saharan Africa lags far behind at just over $3,000. This massive divergence tells a powerful story about economic progress, or the lack of it, between the two regions. Despite starting at roughly the same place, South Asia's GNI grew more than 2.5 times in 3 decades, while Sub-Saharan Africa's growth has been sluggish in comparison. Take Bangladesh, for example. In the early 2010s, while Africa's infrastructure deficit was a hot topic, Bangladesh ranked 130 out of 134 countries in the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Report for infrastructure quality. That's very near the bottom. Similarly, Vietnam and Indonesia ranked poorly at 123 and 90 respectively. Meanwhile, African countries like Kenya at number 88, Cote d'Ivoire at number 80, and Senegal at number 81 ranked significantly higher. And yet, it's Bangladesh, not Kenya or any of those other countries, that has built a $30 billion apparel export industry employing over 4 million workers, even with unreliable electricity and inefficient seaports. David Ndii gives a compelling example in his paper that goes something like this. Imagine for a moment that Kenya woke up tomorrow with infrastructure as good as South Korea's. Bridges, roads, seaports, and power grids, all magically upgraded overnight. What's next? Would that alone unlock industrial growth and prosperity? History suggests otherwise. Take Kenya's modest apparel export industry, which has been around since the early 1990s. Today it employs about 50,000 workers, a fraction of what Bangladesh's industry supports. Despite Bangladesh's infrastructure being ranked below Kenya's in both the Global Competitiveness Report and the World Bank's Logistics Performance Index, its apparel sector has flourished in the last 30 years, driving economic growth and creating millions of jobs. This stark contrast raises tough questions. If infrastructure quality alone explained economic growth, why haven't Kenya and the African nations with better rankings achieved similar results? Why has the push for massive infrastructure investments across Africa failed to deliver the expected economic boom? And why, instead of spurring growth, has it left countries like Kenya grappling with soaring debt and stagnating development? These questions point to a deeper problem with the infrastructure-led growth thesis and suggest that Africa's development strategy might need a fundamental rethink. So what's the solution? Experts like David Ndii argue that Africa's focus should shift from expensive infrastructure projects to agriculture, particularly improving productivity for smallholder farmers. He points out that Africa has some of the lowest agricultural productivity rates in the world, and simple investments in essentials like fertilizer, improved seeds, and wells could generate massive returns. According to Ndii, these interventions could increase cereal output by hundreds of millions of tons annually and add tens of billions of dollars to Africa's GDP. He also emphasizes that agriculture directly addresses poverty and hunger, as most African farmers operate at a small-scale, semi-subsistence level. Instead of the current unsustainable practice of expanding farmland into forests and rangelands, Ndii argues that improving productivity offers a more sustainable and impactful path forward. Drawing lessons from Latin America, he believes agriculture can deliver inclusive, long-term growth far more effectively than grand infrastructure projects. However, Latin America isn't exactly a beacon of perfection. The region struggles with persistent poverty, glaring inequality, and stubbornly high unemployment rates. Sure, it's wealthier than Africa in many ways, but it's still considered a developing region, one that's far from solving its own challenges. And that raises a pretty obvious question. Why would Africa model its success on a region that's still trying to figure out its own path to prosperity? It's like copying someone's homework when you know they didn't get all the answers right either. Not that you should be copying anyone else's homework, but that's not the point. If Africa wants to chart a truly transformative path, it might be time to look beyond flawed models and create one that actually works. The true answer to Africa's growth challenge lies in history, a history that Dr. Ha-Joon Chang expertly unpacks in his brilliant book, Bad Samaritans. Chang challenges the myth of free trade and reveals the real secret behind global prosperity: manufacturing. Throughout history, the richest nations rose to power by focusing on building strong manufacturing industries. Britain's Industrial Revolution, championed by Robert Walpole nearly 300 years ago, and the United States policies under Alexander Hamilton over 2 centuries ago, laid the foundations for their economic dominance. Even in the mid-20th century, developing nations adopted similar strategies to foster growth. Manufacturing doesn't just drive productivity and create jobs. It fosters innovation, strengthens economic resilience, and lays the groundwork for sustainable growth. Natural resources, on the other hand, often create a false sense of security. Sure, some countries have grown wealthy off their resources, like Argentina with its wheat and beef exports in the early 20th century, or modern oil-rich nations. But this type of wealth is inherently fragile. Resources can run out, be replaced by synthetic alternatives, or fail to spark the technological advancements needed for long-term growth. Guatemala learned this the hard way in the 19th century, when synthetic dyes wiped out its once thriving cochineal dye industry almost overnight. Even worse, resource wealth tends to fuel inequality. In many resource-rich nations, the benefit of resource exploitation are concentrated in the hands of a few elites, while the majority remain stuck in poverty. This resource curse often leads to corruption, weak institutions, and poor investment in critical sectors like education and healthcare. The result is a society where a small group becomes extraordinarily wealthy, while inequality, poverty, and unemployment persist. Chang's lesson is clear. The countries that have truly thrived are those that have actively promoted manufacturing. Manufacturing doesn't just grow economies, it spreads wealth more evenly, builds skills, and provides a foundation for technological advancement. For Africa, following this historical blueprint isn't just a strategy, it's a necessity if the continent wants to break free from cycles of inequality and resource dependency. For Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, the importance of manufacturing isn't just an academic theory, it's deeply personal. He was born in South Korea and grew up during one of the most extraordinary transformations in modern history. What happened in South Korea during the latter half of the 20th century is often called the miracle on the Han River. The country went from being one of the poorest nations in the world, exporting basic commodities like tungsten, fish, and wigs made from human hair, to becoming a global leader in technology, producing mobile phones, flat-screen TVs, and semiconductors. The numbers tell the story of an almost unbelievable transformation. In 1961, South Korea's annual income per person was just $82, less than half of Ghana's at the time. Its economy was comparable to that of Congo, and it lagged behind the Philippines. The country was still recovering from the devastation of the Korean War, which had wiped out half of its manufacturing base, destroyed 75% of its railways, and killed or displaced up to 15% of its population. By all accounts, South Korea looked like a developmental failure. Fast forward to today, and South Korea's yearly income per person has soared to over $30,000. Life expectancy has climbed from just 53 years in the 1960s to around 77 years now. In his book Bad Samaritans, Dr. Chang famously wrote that South Korea's progress was equivalent to Haiti transforming into Switzerland within 40 years. What took the United States 150 years and the United Kingdom over 200 years, South Korea achieved in less than half a century. But South Korea's story isn't a simple one. It's complex, multifaceted, and full of lessons that challenge conventional ideas about economic growth. It wasn't just about factories and exports. It involved bold government policies, targeted investments, and yes, some controversial choices that shaped its trajectory. To understand how South Korea pulled off this transformation, we need to delve into its history. What decisions were made? what risks were taken, and what sacrifices allowed this nation to rise from the ashes of war to become a global economic powerhouse. Let's explore the remarkable story of South Korea's rise. South Korea's economic miracle kicked off in 1961 with a series of 5-year economic development plans led by Park Chung-hee, a former general who came to power through a military coup. During his time in office, South Korea experienced the bulk of the growth that helped uplift the country out of third world status and set it on a path towards becoming an economic powerhouse. Although South Korea described itself as a free market economy, it was really the South Korean government driving economic growth up until the 1980s and 90s. This was clear from the structure of the government, where the head of the Economic Planning Board, or the EPB, held the rank of Deputy Prime Minister, making them second in command. The EPB had enormous power to shape the country's economy. The government controlled things like capital movement, especially for foreign investment, set prices, and decided where to allocate resources. They even funded research and development and shared the financial risks with the private sector. A key part of South Korea's economic development strategy was the EPB's ability to direct resources into industries it saw as critical for growth. To make this happen, President Park nationalized the banking sector just 5 months into his presidency, allowing the government to control 96.4% of the country's financial assets by 1970. With the government as the sole provider of credit, the lifeblood of business, companies had to follow the government's plans to rapidly expand production and exports, even if it meant putting short-term profitability on the back burner. In 1973, President Park launched an ambitious industrial program called the Heavy and Chemical Industrialization Program. This program aimed to achieve Park's bold goal of raising the country's per capita income to $1,000 by 1981, while also addressing geopolitical insecurities after the withdrawal of 24,000 US combat troops from South Korea. With the Korean War still fresh in the minds of many officials, there was a strong push to develop heavy industry to become self-reliant in defense. As a result, many of the industries that grew during this time were defense-related, like petrochemicals, steel, shipbuilding, non-ferrous metals, and electronics. This initiative led to the creation of South Korea's first steel mill, modern shipyard, and locally designed cars, while new companies emerged in advanced industries like electronics, machinery, and chemicals. The results were nothing short of remarkable. Between 1972 and 1979, the country's per capita income grew more than 5 times, and exports exploded, growing 9 times. Park not only met his $1,000 per capita income goal, but he achieved it 4 years ahead of schedule. Even though South Korea was a key ally of the US during the Cold War and did receive some foreign aid, this aid played a surprisingly small role in the country's industrial success. President Park was severely critical of how his predecessor, Syngman Rhee, had relied so heavily on aid in the 1950s, seeing it as a weakness that distracted the government from its main goal of driving rapid development. As a result, the level of aid dropped sharply in the 1960s. To fund his plans for rapid industrialization, President Park and his government passed the law guaranteeing repayment for loans in July 1962. This law allowed the government to guarantee both the principal and interest on foreign loans taken by companies, as long as the loans were approved by key institutions like the Ministry of Finance, the Bank of Korea, and the Korea Reconstruction Bank. This gave the state complete control over foreign investment, acting as a middleman between international lenders and domestic businesses. As a result, foreign loans to large companies, known as chaebols, surged, making up 36.6% of gross investment by the early 1970s. These chaebols are massive South Korean conglomerates, often controlled by a single person or family. Some well-known examples include Samsung, Hyundai, and LG Group. Foreign direct investment was also tightly regulated to keep control of South Korea's industrial base in South Korean hands. Starting in 1966, foreign equity holdings were capped at 50% and limited to specific industries, especially in export-oriented, heavy, and chemical sectors. The only exceptions were companies in free export zones, where full foreign ownership was allowed, along with other incentives like tax breaks. However, these free export zones made up just a small percentage of overall FDI, only 10% by 1975. What's even more surprising is that FDI only contributed 5% to gross investment in manufacturing and just 1% to gross domestic capital formation between 1964 and 1973. President Park approached his mission to expand South Korea's export base with the same military precision he had mastered as a general. Between 1962 and 1972, his administration implemented a 50% tax break on all export earnings, giving businesses a strong incentive to focus on exporting. On top of that, the government provided subsidized credit, making it easier for exporters to access the capital they needed to grow and operate. These export promotion policies thrived as South Korea tapped into expanding markets, fueled by the booming post-war advanced economies and demand created by the Vietnam War. The abrupt end of South Korea's export promotion policies came with tough macroeconomic conditions after 1972, including the 1973 to 1974 recession, oil price shocks, and rising interest rates in the late 1970s. Since South Korea was heavily dependent on exports and foreign debt, these global challenges hit especially hard. In response, the government worked to stimulate the economy by borrowing heavily from abroad and expanding domestic credit, which led to a drop in foreign exchange reserves. While many non-oil producing countries faced serious recessions, South Korea's economy defied the odds. It posted impressive GDP growth rates of 7.7% in 1974, 6.9% in 1975, and a remarkable 14.4% in 1976. The government didn't just provide financial support, it also offered non-monetary help through favorable regulations. A standout example is when the government, which owned South Korea's only oil refinery at the time, ordered that all crude oil be transported using Hyundai Heavy Industries ships. This move was a lifeline for Hyundai, the first Korean-owned shipbuilding company, which was struggling with cancelled orders. This jumpstart helped Hyundai grow, and just a decade later, it became the world's largest shipbuilder. South Korea's government also generously rewarded the companies that followed its development plans, but didn't hesitate to cut off those that didn't. Since most companies relied on debt and the government controlled all financial institutions and foreign investment, they had the power to shut down businesses if they saw fit. For instance, Daewoo Motors was allowed to go bankrupt, and when Taihan Group's consumer electronics division failed, it was transferred over to Daewoo Electronics. And that's not all. Kids in school were taught that it was their patriotic duty to report anyone smoking foreign cigarettes because the country needed every cent of foreign exchange to import the machinery and materials necessary to build better industries. Dr. Ha Jung Chang takes it even further in Bad Samaritans, writing, "Valuable foreign currencies were really the blood and sweat of our industrial soldiers, fighting the export war in the country's factories." Spending foreign currency on anything not essential for industrial development was either banned or heavily discouraged. The government implemented this by imposing import bans, high tariffs, and luxury consumption taxes on non-essential items, including small things like sweets, whiskey, and cookies. Even foreign travel was banned unless the government gave special permission for business or study abroad. For context, tariffs are taxes or duties that a government places on goods being imported into or exported out of a country. Think of them as a tool that makes foreign products more expensive so that locally made products have a better chance to compete. For example, if a country imposes a 20% tariff on imported cars, those cars become 20% more expensive than they originally cost, encouraging people to buy locally made cars instead. Tariffs can also be a way for governments to earn revenue, protect key industries, or even retaliate against trade policies of other countries. Another factor that sped up South Korea's growth was its lax approach to protecting foreign and intellectual property. Korean entrepreneurs reverse engineered products like computers and Nike shoes and pirated books and movies for education and entertainment. Since most Koreans couldn't afford the real products, this allowed entrepreneurs to gain new skills and exposure to the global market. Of course, there were dark sides to this rapid development. Child labor in homes and factories, terrible working conditions for low pay, and the rise of slums in cities were all part of the picture. Things also took a major hit in 1979 when President Park was assassinated by the head of his own intelligence service due to growing discontent with his dictatorship and the economic challenges brought on by the second oil shock. Despite these setbacks, by the early 1980s, South Korea had firmly established itself as a middle-income country. Korea's economic strategy and incredible success didn't just happen by chance. It was a result of careful state planning and smart market incentives. Unlike what many free market advocates would have preferred, the Korean government deliberately intervened in the market to help its industries grow and develop. The government picked certain industries to nurture, providing them with subsidies, tariff protection, and support services like overseas market research. These industries were chosen in consultation with the private sector and given time to grow until they were strong enough to compete internationally. For context, subsidies are financial support that a government gives to businesses, industries, or individuals to help them reduce costs and stay competitive. Think of them as a kind of boost to make something cheaper or more profitable. For example, a government might give subsidies to farmers by helping pay for seeds, fertilizers, or machinery. This allows farmers to produce more food at lower costs, which can keep food prices down for consumers. Subsidies can also encourage businesses to invest in specific industries like energy or manufacturing that the government wants to grow. Korea didn't abolish the market like communist powers, but it also didn't blindly follow the free market. Instead, the government intervened strategically when necessary to support the nation's development. South Korea's approach to economic development is known as industrial policy, a strategy where the government deliberately nurtures industries, shielding them and supporting their growth until they are competitive enough to take on global markets. It's not about blindly opening up markets and hoping for growth. It's about strategically deciding which industries to prioritize and making sure they have the tools to succeed. Industrial policy wasn't just used by South Korea to industrialize rapidly. It was also followed by countries like Japan and China. In summary, the strategy was to use the limited foreign exchange earned from exporting simple goods like agricultural products and minerals to purchase more advanced technologies and machinery that would enable them to build industries like garments and cheap electronics. These in turn earned foreign exchange that helped build up more advanced industries like semiconductors, consumer electronics, and automobiles, which were all initially protected from global competition by tariffs and subsidies. The crux of this strategy was a technology transferred from advanced economies to developing economies, paid for by foreign exchange earnings. Governments can acquire technology in a variety of ways: purchasing advanced machinery, licensing intellectual property, reverse engineering foreign products, or even partnering with foreign companies. These technologies are then used to move up the value chain, investing in industries with higher productivity and long-term potential. However, the tariffs and subsidies were not permanent. They were meant to incubate these industries long enough for them to absorb the new technologies, adopt efficient organizational structures, and ultimately become globally competitive. It's like raising a child. If you pull them out of school early to start working, they might earn money through low-skill jobs, but they'll never become a brain surgeon or a developmental economist. Those high-skill jobs require more time and protection for the child to develop the necessary skills to compete in the real world. This is exactly what enabled Samsung, now a global symbol of South Korea's success, to become what it is today. Founded in 1938 as an exporter of fish, vegetables, and fruit, Samsung transitioned to manufacturing sugar and textiles in the 1950s. By the late 1970s, it had ventured into electronics, producing televisions, and by the mid-1980s, it was manufacturing semiconductors, the backbone of modern technology. Within just 40 years, Samsung went from a small commodity exporter to a global leader in advanced manufacturing. Today, Samsung is responsible for an astonishing 20% of the value on South Korea's stock exchange, generates $100 billion in exports annually, and accounts for 15% of the nation's GDP. And South Korea's industrial policy didn't just create Samsung, it sparked the rise of an entire ecosystem of globally competitive companies. These successes didn't just elevate individual companies, they transformed South Korea's entire economy. By focusing on building a strong industrial base, South Korea went from exporting raw materials and low-value goods to dominating high-tech industries. The results were clear. In just a few decades, South Korea not only created global brands, but established itself as a powerhouse of innovation and economic strength. This transformation didn't happen by accident. It was the result of a deliberate economic strategy that prioritized learning, growth, and industrial development over quick profits. South Korea's success with industrial policy shows that with the right plan, it's possible to move from commodities to cutting-edge industries, turning national potential into global dominance. But you might be thinking, South Korea was just an isolated case. Its success story isn't something other countries can replicate. After all, wealthy countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and Japan, now strong advocates of free trade for developing countries, often claim that free markets were the key to their own economic success. That assumption, however, couldn't be more wrong. South Korea's rise wasn't an exception. It was part of a broader pattern seen throughout history. The truth is, these wealthy nations also relied heavily on protectionism, industrial policy, and government intervention during their early stages of development. Their free trade rhetoric for developing nations today hides a history of strategies remarkably similar to those South Korea employed. So no, South Korea wasn't alone. It was following a playbook that has driven the success of many of today's richest countries. Now, let's ask the obvious question. If these strategies worked so well for today's richest countries, why are they now discouraged or outright denied for developing nations? The answer lies in what economist Friedrich List famously called kicking away the ladder. List was a German thinker who, in 1841, accused Britain of preaching free trade to other countries while having achieved its own industrial supremacy through high tariffs and government subsidies. Once Britain reached the top, List argued, he turned around and removed the very tools that could help others climb the same path. This ladder kicking isn't just a historical anecdote, it's a practice that continues to shape global economic policy. Today, some rich countries actively discourage developing nations from using protective tariffs, subsidies, or state-led industrial policies, insisting that free trade and open markets are the only way forward. To make matters worse, many of these nations don't even recognize their own double standards. Over time, the true history of capitalism has been rewritten, intentionally or not, to fit the narrative of free trade as the ultimate path to prosperity. This selective memory is perpetuated by institutions like the World Bank, World Trade Organization, and the IMF, which often impose conditions on loans that require developing countries to open their markets, cut tariffs, and reduce state intervention. The same tactics Britain used to keep its colonies economically dependent and prevent them from building competitive industries. All this while the wealthiest nations continue to protect their own industries in subtle but significant ways, such as agricultural subsidies, intellectual property laws, and favorable trade agreements. Developing countries have been conditioned to believe that industrialization is beyond their reach, as if the path followed by nations like the US, the UK, or South Korea is somehow closed to them. Instead, they are told to rely on theories like infrastructure-led development, agriculture-based growth, or even the celebrated concept of comparative advantage. But we've already debunked the first two, and the third, comparative advantage, is a dangerous illusion. It suggests that agricultural societies should stick to farming because that's their so-called strength, while industrialized nations dominate the more lucrative manufacturing and technology sectors. What they don't tell you is that this theory only works under one critical assumption: technology remains static and equal. South Korea, Japan, and China shattered this myth, becoming global tech leaders despite having no initial comparative advantage in manufacturing or electronics. The way out of this trap is clear. Developing countries must acquire advanced technologies, nurture skilled labor, and build industries that challenge the status quo. Balaji Srinivasan in The Network State has a great chapter entitled, "If the News is Fake, Imagine History." The chapter highlights how popular narratives, even those seemingly rooted in fact, can be carefully engineered to serve specific interests. He explores the pervasive hoaxes of recent decades and warns that if media narratives can be manipulated so easily, what about the histories we've been taught? Could our history books be an elaborate collection of fake news designed to uphold the status quo? What's even more baffling is that many rich countries don't seem to know their own history, or perhaps they've conveniently chosen to forget it. By rewriting the narrative of their rise to prosperity, they've aligned their past with their present-day ideology of free markets and minimal state intervention. Whether this amnesia is deliberate or subconscious, it serves their current worldview, allowing them to justify policies that keep developing nations at a disadvantage while masking the uncomfortable truth of how they actually became wealthy. Ideology is a powerful and dangerous thing, as we established in our video on ideology, linked in the description below, because this isn't just a philosophical debate. The cost of economic mistakes, whether rooted in fake history or misguided ideology, is catastrophic for billions of people. Endless spending on infrastructure or relying solely on agriculture to drive economies hasn't delivered sustainable or equitable development. History has proven this over and over, yet these are still the paths being pushed by those in power. No one discounts the importance of infrastructure. It's essential, but only when it fits into a much larger strategic plan. Infrastructure is a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. Without a comprehensive industrial policy to guide its use, it risks becoming an expensive, underutilized investment. Developing countries often shy away from adopting industrial policies because they fear losing foreign investment. But history tells a different story. China, for example, used aggressive industrial policies for decades, regulating foreign investments, protecting its industries, and nurturing its domestic champions. Yet it still attracted massive foreign investment. Why? Because success draws investors. Capitalists are driven by returns, not ideology. If you demonstrate that your economy can generate big profits and ensure those profits are secure, they won't care whether you use free market orthodoxy or state-led industrial policy. It's results that matter, not the rhetoric. If we are to build a better, fairer world, we must reject these narratives and ground our decisions in truth and reason. History has shown us the most reliable path to development: industrialization through state-led policies, strategic protectionism, and investment in high-value industries. Why experiment with models that have repeatedly failed? The stakes are too high. Economic missteps aren't just numbers on a balance sheet. They mean lives lost, opportunities missed, and futures destroyed. This is a matter of life and death, particularly in Africa, where the consequences of misguided policies are all too real. To all African leaders, policymakers, and influencers, the time to act is now. The tools of development are within our reach, but only if we choose to use them. If history has shown us the way, the most humane, impactful thing we can do is to follow it. Africa deserves greatness, not someday, but now. People deserve to live, to flourish, and to thrive. Let's not let the mistakes of the past become the burdens of the future. Let's choose the truth and let that truth guide us to a better tomorrow. If you thought this video was eye-opening, you can start by liking, sharing, and subscribing. See you soon, and good luck as you make the world a more truthful, rational, and impactful place.